Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached the Wednesday. It is an absolutely gorgeous December day here in the mountains of Appalachia in southern West Virginia, and I trust that it is a nice day where you are as well. We had some bad weather earlier in the week, but it has all passed. It's looking like it's not going to be this way for long. It's quite chilly out, but on the other hand, the sun is shining, the sky is blue, and the wind is fairly calm. And so it's absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful winter day here in the mountains. And it's the day you kind of the day you dream about. It's the reason why people who claim that they like to live where they have enjoyed 4 seasons. This is the fourth season that the people really enjoy. You know, the days where it's crisp and cold and clear and bright, and it is, and it is a pleasure. And of course, for me, the best part of the day is the final 2 hours before it gets dark, because that's the time that I get to visit with you here at the Virtual Center, and I look forward to that each day that we get together. And I appreciate your willingness to tune in and to join us. I also encourage you to participate actively in the program. We have a phone number, and the phone number will get you directly into the Head On Radio Network studios, and we will get you on the air within seconds. And we would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your concerns, your considerations, your observations, questions, whatever you might have to share, not only with me, but most importantly with others who are listening to our program. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, 906, all one word, @gmail.com. I just learned, and I didn't know this until 10 minutes ago, but I just learned that there was a delivery problem, a technical problem with yesterday's broadcast. And Bob mentioned it to me. Of course, I didn't know it. I just went on and did the entire 2 hours, not knowing that there was a problem. But apparently, there was a problem in terms of delivery, and apparently the program was being recorded over the previous day's program, or something like that. The point is that Bob told me that he wished that somebody had alerted him to the fact that the broadcast was flawed, and we could have corrected it. Bob says the problem was in the studios, and there was no way I knew we were on the air. I didn't have any idea that there was an issue. But that's kind of what the phone number helps us find. So again, I wish that somebody had called and alerted the folks at Head On that we were having a problem, and that the delivery was not going well. Either that or maybe there was nobody out there. I don't know, but I like to believe that there were at least a few folks out there listening to our program. But anyway, please, if there is a program, if you do pick up any problem with delivery, if the quality of the sound isn't right, or if there's background music or some other kinds of interference with the program, then by all means pick up the phone and call 304-658-33, and let the folks at Head On Radio Network in the studio know, and then they can correct it, because I won't know here. And again, even if you don't want to be on the air, you can just call them and let them know that hey, there's background noise, or the sound's not coming through, the program is not coming through as clearly or as loudly as it should, or whatever. And they can correct it, because what we ended up with was a 2-hour program that at the end we really don't have anything, we don't have much that we can use again, or more important, that other people can relate to, can tie into. As I think back on yesterday's program, I really believe that it's one of those that you can't recreate. I can remember the content, but there's no way I can recreate the mood and the tone and the sense and all that, because I really believe that the point that we were making yesterday, and the reason I'm saying this is because it does lead into what I'd like to do today. But so it's a little bit of review, but more importantly, it's a review that's a little bit skewed in the sense that I'm using the review not only to refresh your memory and your minds as to some of the materials and issues that we touched upon yesterday, but more important than that, it sets the groundwork, or pretty much creates the kind of foundation that I'd like to create for the issue and the theme of today's program. So yesterday, if you remember, we were talking about, which is a program that we began on Monday, talking about the resurfacing, if you wanted to call it that, or the reemergence of a laissez-faire ideology in America over the last 30 to 35 years, beginning principally with the election in 1980 of Ronald Reagan. That really sets off the modern conservative movement, which really is a key part of this whole resurgence of the idea of laissez-faire theory. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday was the article that we looked at on Monday, which was a piece by Thomas McGarity, who is in the law school at the University of Texas in Austin. And he's the one that calls attention to this resurgence or reemergence of laissez-faire economics in American society. The idea that the less government, the better. The idea that the more minimal government's visibility and activity is, the better off we all are, the better off the free market system operates, etc. In other words, the idea of laissez-faire is a defined role for government, which basically defines that role as government not being involved in the economy or in economic development or regulation at all. It's the extreme of managed free enterprise capitalism. It's contrary to the idea, if you go back to the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea of European or Western mercantilism, which is linked up with the emergence of capitalism. Mercantilism was the first phase of capitalism. It was the commercial phase prior to the Industrial Revolution. Once industrialism happens, then the whole idea of free enterprise capitalism becomes somewhat different and so much larger and more ominous. And I don't use ominous in a negative way at all here. I'm talking about the fact that when you combine commercial issues with industrialism, what you get is the emergence of an economic system which basically drives the West and drives the entire world from then on, and really continues to. Now we're dealing with what many people believe is a new revolution, which is the revolution in communication, basically linked principally to the internet. And so what we hear today all the time is about the information revolution. And so we've moved into the next phase beyond industrialism. Well, mercantilism was the initial phase of free enterprise capitalism prior to the Industrial Revolution. It was the phase when most of the emphasis on the market, on free markets, was in the area of commerce and trade. And the idea, of course, the idea that takes hold initially is the idea that commercial success is tied to national growth. That's what mercantilism is, national growth and power. And the idea increasingly is that a nation's power is measured by its wealth. And access to the wealth of the world is principally linked to commerce and commercial power and influence. So consequently, those nations which have the strongest commercial visibility and presence dominate the world. And what we see historically, for example, is that the first nation to unify under a strong king and become a modern nation, if you will, was Portugal. So consequently, it's Portugal that is the first Western nation to send out explorers and ultimately to begin sending ships and looking for commercial opportunities and advantage around the world that is being discovered as these ventures take place. And then along comes Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. Once Ferdinand and Isabella drive Islam from Spain and are able to unite Granada and Castile, the two major states of modern Spain, and create the nation of Spain, then the Spanish government is now united and ready, and of course the very next step is the commissioning of Christopher Columbus to venture out on his missions with the 3 ships in order to find a direct route to the east by traveling west. And we know about that story. And then there is Great Britain, which unifies and becomes a modern nation, and then France. And so consequently what happens is that as each nation unifies and becomes modern, it begins to associate commercial access and the pursuit of wealth with national power. And once nations make that connection, they become modern nations, they become colonizers, because ultimately colonies fit very well into the mercantilist worldview, because colonies potentially are places where potential wealth might exist in the form of gold and silver, which is, of course, what allows Spain to dominate the world for so long. Raw materials like timber and fur, and the things that pay off for France's colonization in Canada, and then ultimately Great Britain and the establishment of the 13 colonies along the coast, the east coast of North America, and Britain's effort to manage that empire in such a way that she is able to maximize the wealth coming out of the colonies by channeling them through a series of navigation acts, channeling that wealth back through Great Britain, and then brokering commercial expansion throughout Europe and the rest of the world. And Great Britain is able to dominate the world for so long. And of course, what we see is a series of world wars for dominance, for world dominance. And what we see in the 18th century in Europe is a series of 4 major wars between England and France. By this time, Spain and Portugal have both lost their preeminent positions. And now world power has resulted in a struggle between France and England. And ultimately, with the British victory, the English victory in the 4th war, which is called the 7 Years' War, which begins in 1756 and ends in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. In America, it's called the French and Indian War. And the result of that war is that in 1763, England, as a result of the treaty, England is successful in taking Canada from France, driving France from the eastern portion of the North American continent. And for all practical purposes, England is the most powerful and commercially visible and wealthiest empire in the world in the Western world at that time. And so mercantilism is the commercial stage, if you will, of capitalism. And then, of course, the Industrial Revolution doesn't really take off until the late 18th and through the 19th century. And in America, it doesn't take off until the late 19th century after the Civil War, because the United States cannot really take off in terms of industrial development until the sectional struggles between North and South are resolved. And, of course, unfortunately, it takes a civil war to do that. But once the Civil War is over and once the Union is reconstructed, if you will, in the late 1860s, then beginning in the 1870s, the Industrial Revolution in America takes off. So within 30 years, by the turn of the century in 1900, the United States has become a competitor among the major industrial powers of the world. The United States is a major competitor for dominance and power and control of wealth in the world as a result of its industrial growth in the late 19th century. So again, that's kind of the background. The philosophy, if you will, that drives industrialism in late 19th century America is laissez-faire, is the economic theory of so-called laissez-faire, which is minimal government, absent government regulation of the economy. The idea being that corporations, business, is given its head and allowed to do what it does best, which is make money and expand. And the idea is that free enterprise capitalism, which is really what this is, works best when it is allowed to work naturally without interference by anyone or any entity, and that especially means government. And so in the late 19th century, supported by a very conservative Supreme Court, the business community in America is really given its head. Business is dealing with very minimal regulation by government, either on the state level or on the national level during this period. And corporate attorneys, businesses' attorneys, are constantly going to the Supreme Court seeking greater and greater freedom from government control and government regulation. And, of course, the upside is that industrially the United States dominates the world. The downside is the more negative aspects of free enterprise capitalism, which is what happens to labor, what happens to the poor, the growth of poverty and crime in the nation's cities, the spread of disease, hunger, homelessness, and all the rest of it. And those kinds of circumstances, the downside of the Industrial Revolution, are the ingredients of what brings government back into the picture at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century in what we call progressivism, which is the idea that the only way free enterprise industrialism can work is to rein in the freedom that corporations have been given and subject them to government regulation, which is effectively regulation by the people, by the representatives of the people, in order to guarantee that while private sector businesses are making money, they are also operating in the public interest. In other words, the benefits of industrialism don't only go to the owners of these corporations, but rather the benefits are made available and redistributed throughout society in terms of job opportunities, improved standards of living, improved quality of food and drugs, and many of the other regulations and government regulatory agencies which are created during this period as part of government's efforts to regulate and direct and manage free enterprise capitalism. And so from this point on, laissez-faire tends to become only a theory endorsed and supported by the most conservatives of American interests. And the bulk of public opinion in America has shifted into a much more liberal, progressive stance, which is based on the idea that some sort of balance between government regulation on the one hand and corporate freedom and independence on the other is the ideal. And of course, what we've seen throughout the 20th century after that is an effort to try to strike that balance. At times, the nation is leaning left towards progressivism, towards liberalism. At other times, the pendulum seems to be swinging towards the right, toward much less government, much smaller government, much more invisible government, and much more corporate freedom and independence. And that's kind of a background. We talked about this yesterday. Now what we are witnessing from the period of Ronald Reagan on over the last 30 or 35 years is a resurgence of laissez-faire ideology. But McGarity's article points out he no longer refers to it as laissez-faire ideology. He uses the term laissez-faire theology, because what we are dealing with right now are conservative pundits who are so committed to the idea of laissez-faire, to the idea of reducing and minimizing government's ability to regulate and manage and control the economy, that those who subscribe to laissez-faire have moved beyond the idea of ideology to the idea of theology. In other words, in their mind, laissez-faire free enterprise capitalism is not a theory in competition with other theories. It's more than that. It's truth. The assumption is laissez-faire is no longer an ideology which must compete with others. What we have reached right now is a stage where those people who we deem the most conservative in society, those who are committed to the idea of laissez-faire and minimal government, believe it's the only way to go. That economic development and jobs and economic expansion and quality of life and standard of living and all the other things that are associated with economic development are a direct result of the extent to which they believe business and corporate America are allowed to operate free of government regulation, red tape, management, restrictions, rules, agencies, and all the rest of it. So part of the effort to create that kind of corporate freedom has been an attack on government, which has gone on in spurts, but has gone on rather continuously for the last 30 years. Every conceivable effort in the world to point out the inadequacies of government and the failures of government to manage have been brought to bear in this 30-year era, which is what McGarity refers to as the rebirth of laissez-faire theology, because it really is that in the minds of these people. And what I'm thinking are the most conservative, the so-called Tea Partiers, for example. These are the people that are so committed to the idea that they believe it's not an idea in the midst of in competition with other ideas, it's the truth. And they believe that whatever they need to do in order to impart this truth on everybody else, they should do. They know they're right. It's ceased to be an ideology among other ideologies. It has become instead truth. And this is a very, very detailed review of what we did yesterday. And my thinking is because we lost so much of yesterday, I think some of this background might be called for. And so what we are dealing with then is a laissez-faire theology, a contest, a take-no-prisoners kind of crusade that is underway in America by conservative thinkers and ideologues in various sectors, in the academy, in the marketplace, in jurisprudence, in our courts, in our legislatures, amongst our governors, and the think tanks that are basically creating the kind of academic and intellectual fodder to support this movement. It's very important, because what we see, not only the creation of conservative think tanks, and I'm thinking specifically of organizations like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation and many of these other, the Herbert Hoover Institute at Stanford, and many of these other places which are prominent conservative intellectual and ideological think tanks. All of this has come out of the conservative push that began after World War II, but especially after the so-called Great Society programs of the 1960s and 70s. There was obviously the interlude of the 1970s with the emergence of the Watergate scandal which forced the resignation of Richard Nixon, and then there was the 4-year period where the country seemed to take a deep breath and wanted somebody in there who was honest. In other words, there was nobody who could serve in the White House after Watergate but Jimmy Carter. We wanted virtue, we wanted honesty, we wanted Christian charity, we wanted morality, we wanted all the things that Jimmy Carter seemed to offer the nation. And so we had this 4-year interlude from the election of 76 up to the election in 1980 of Ronald Reagan. And again, you can look at the Iranian hostage situation and the inflation and all the other economic problems that the nation faced under President Carter as kind of forming the backdrop or the background for the emergence of Reagan republicanism in the 1980s. But that begins the resurgence of conservatism in America as never before. And that's what McGarity is talking about in his article. That's what he defined as laissez-faire theology, and that's what we've been talking about. And the issue that I think, and this is really the thrust of our program yesterday, the issue is that we're not talking here about competing ideas that prevail in the marketplace of ideas through discussion and analysis and understanding and education. We're talking about an ideology that is able to dominate the marketplace because it demands obedience. It is a belief system. It is, in other words, it is not the result of the pursuit of truth that leads to this idea of laissez-faire ideology and the minimalist role that it defines for government. It's not the fact that it has prevailed in the marketplace of ideas. It has won out in the competition with other competing theories. The difference is that this effort has been pushed in a number of sectors, academic think tanks on college campuses, much more aggressive behavior and actions on the part of business and conservative thinkers, much more money being put into the campaign to educate young people on college campuses, to build support for free enterprise capitalism within our schools, I'm thinking of organizations. The organization that I'm familiar with that became very, very prominent in the 1980s was an organization, the acronym of which is called SIFE, which is Society for Institutional Freedom in Economics. And I know we had a chapter of SIFE on the campus here at Concord University. And it's basically an organization within the Department of Business that recruits students, and the ideas of this organization is to promote support for free enterprise capitalism, for the ideology of laissez-faire. And so it tended to attract the most conservative students, and this organization and organizations like it are well-funded by some of these conservative think tanks and some of the corporate money that's pouring into this effort. And McGarity points to the efforts of former Senator from Illinois, Simon, who was Treasury Secretary under both Nixon and Gerald Ford in the 1970s. And Simon, a very, very conservative Treasury Secretary, was responsible for what in the Reagan administration becomes the Office of Management and Budget, which really drives economic theory in the Reagan administration. And McGarity gives this organization and gives Simon a lot of the credit for the resurgence of conservatism in American business and in American corporate life during this period. The point that I made is that also during this period we have the Powell Memorandum, which is a memorandum to the National Chamber of Commerce written by Lewis Powell, a corporate attorney in Virginia, a member of the Circuit Court who is appointed to the Supreme Court in the late 70s, about 4 or 5, I think 1976 actually, is when Lewis Powell is appointed to the Supreme Court. It is my thinking that if his memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce, which is kind of a game plan for a conservative counter-revolution against the liberalism and the radicalism of the 1960s and 70s, not only on college campuses but within business communities itself. It poses and proposes that the Chamber of Commerce lead and fund a much more aggressive business community that begins to defend free enterprise and begins to move much more actively and much more visibly on college campuses, and becomes much more visible in political discussions around the country. And of course, it's during this period and as a result of this effort that organizations like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation and many of these others come into play. This is obviously the same period when conservative talk radio takes off, at the beginning in the person of Rush Limbaugh, but as we know, it continued to grow and expand since then until, for all practical purposes, terrestrial talk radio in America became dominated by conservative hosts who became the spokesman for laissez-faire economic theory. But again, so firm and committed were these people to it, and so no holds barred was the campaign, that calling it economic theory is no longer accurate. McGarity calls it laissez-faire theology. And I think what he is suggesting is that what these people claim to be promoting is not a theory, but economic truth and political truth and reality. And if you don't think, and I'm not going to get into this, I didn't mention this yesterday, but I think it's appropriate that we do mention it here. If one thinks for a minute that this is all impersonal stuff, and all of this stuff happened outside the realm of where we live and work and breathe as American citizens in this day and age, I call your attention to one of the facts that a major figment or factor in this conservative economic resurgence, which began in the 1980s, is the emergence of something called the 401k, which was a major change in American thinking about retirement in this country. You may remember that the progressive liberal approach to retirement, which came out of the New Deal, was Social Security, was Roosevelt's Social Security program. Conservatives took that on, called it communism and Marxism and socialism and everything else, and did everything they do to combat Social Security. And if you remember, well into the 21st century, in the person of George W. Bush, who, if you remember, set out to privatize Social Security. This conservative attack on that so-called poster program, the poster child of the New Deal, if you wanted to call it that, could be, Social Security could be seen as that, along with the right of organized labor to bargain collectively, the union movement. And so those two programs, if you will, Social Security and the right to collective bargain under the so-called Wagner Act in 1937, I believe 1935, I think it is, for the Wagner Act. These become the brunt of conservative attention for the rest of the 20th and well into the 21st century. So we know that. But one of the things that comes out of this conservative resurgence in the 1980s and after is the emergence in the Reagan administration in 1986 of something called the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It's a major change in American tax policy with President Reagan in the White House. Democrats are controlling Congress during this time, but Democrats and Republicans work together on this Tax Reform Act. Speaker of the House at this time was Dan Rostenkowski, who, as many of you know, ended up in prison a number of years ago. But one of the features of the Tax Reform Act of the Reagan era was the development of the idea of 401ks, a retirement program that would replace pensions, a program that would replace guaranteed incomes for American retirees by promising every American the opportunity to become a participant in free enterprise laissez-faire capitalism by owning your own retirement plan. Don't let business control your pension. Don't let your retirement be dependent on business control of your income even after you stop working. Rather, you too can play the market. You too can become an investor in stocks and bonds. You too can get rich the way that Americans have been getting rich for so long, by playing the market and investing in bonds and stocks and securities and all the rest of it. You too can potentially become a millionaire. And this mantra was so successfully sold that millions of Americans voluntarily surrendered their pension programs for 401ks programs, which the retirement packages what they owned and which they could take as they moved from job to job. They could take their retirement program with them because their retirement, their 401k was their own. Didn't belong to anybody else, didn't require employee buy-in anymore. It was now yours. And you too were a potential investor in the stock market. This had all sorts of political overtones because it was a way to combat unionism. It was a way to combat socialism. It was a way to fight actively against the threat of socialism and international communism. It was a way to defeat and destroy the power of unions. It was a way to get government out of the management business in terms of the economy. In other words, it had so many political advantages that the movement towards 401ks became a major part of the aggressive conservative movement of the last 30 years. And of course, the fact of the matter is, we know that while many of the same people that were becoming millionaires and multimillionaires on the stock market continue to do that, except now they were becoming billionaires. And for most people, they continue to struggle along, not realizing until it was time to retire that their 401k wasn't nearly large enough to support retirement lifestyle that came even close to what they were making in income when they were working. And a lot of people have wondered what happened. What happened was that by becoming a participant in the stock market, by becoming a participant in free enterprise capitalist competition, your 401k, your retirement, became vulnerable to the ups and downs of international finance and the market. And so recessions like the one that we just experienced in 2007 and 2008 hit people's 401ks awfully hard. And if you happen to be one who was close to retirement at that time, chances are that you didn't have enough years left in your working life to recover what you lost during that recession. But as you look at the recovery from the recession of 2007 and 2008, notice who's making the money and notice who's not. Notice the emergence of the so-called 1%, and notice the existence of that entity sometimes referred to as the 99%. And what you might be beginning to conclude is that many, many millions of people became the victims of a very successful PR ad campaign. Many of us bought a line, hook, line, and sinker. Many of us believed that we were going to go into the market and we were going to become millionaires. We were going to reap the 14 and 17% interest returns on stocks and bonds and treasury notes and all the rest of it that investors had always been benefiting from in America, but it was always the few. Now it was the many. It was our chance to get our share. And the result is that the middle class that the nation bragged so much about that came out of World War II began to take a beating which it continues to take, as inequality in wealth and in income distribution in America continues to grow wider and wider and wider. More and more continues to go to fewer and fewer, and less continues to go to more and more of us, whether in fact we own 401ks or not. The reason I mentioned this part of it is because this is the part where all of us came into play. Not only did employees and even unions voluntarily surrender pension programs for 401ks, but then in the mid and late 90s, and this was under the tutelage of Bill Clinton, public employees also bought into the 401k rage. And many public employee retirement programs were shifted from guaranteed income programs to guaranteed contribution programs, where people were required to put more and more and more into their own retirement, because the hidden agenda here, the side that we didn't see, is that employees began to put more and more into their own retirement programs, employers on the other side were allowed the opportunity to put less and less into these programs. So the reality is that for many people, the program that they came to own, the retirement program that they came to own, ended up being, to a large extent, their own money. Whereas under the pension programs that existed before, employers were required to make contributions to these retirement programs. And now what is happening in the year 2013? We are witnessing, for example, the city of Detroit filing for bankruptcy and receiving support and approval by the courts to abandon the pension obligations to its municipal employees. And it looks like, from what we're hearing, something in the neighborhood of 125,000 retired people who had been municipal employees in the city of Detroit are seeing their retirement programs whittled away to less than half, sometimes less than a third of what they were supposed to be. All of it legal, all of it endorsed and supported and given the go-ahead by the courts under the mandate of bankruptcy, of municipal bankruptcy. And so just as individuals have been allowed throughout the decades in America to file for bankruptcy as individuals and as companies, now we are seeing municipalities deriving the same benefits by going the bankruptcy route, which is the right to violate contracts they had with their own employees. Contracts that were bargained legally, above board, contracts that were won by working people, many of them who went out on strike and really earned with their own sweat and blood contracts to provide for them and their families when they retired. And now all of those benefits are being forfeited under the nation's bankruptcy laws. That's what's going on. My point is, very, very few of us understood this. Few of us could see this. Few of us could even believe it. One of the things that we believed would always protect us against these kinds of eventualities was government. We believed that in this republic, government's mission to promote the public interest, to promote the general welfare, is what the Constitution says, would mandate that government would never allow these kinds of things to happen to us as citizens. But what we are witnessing are the results of the attack on government. The so-called laissez-faire theology, which has taken hold in America, has also contained an ingredient which is the attack on government. And the result is the agency that was designed to promote the common interest, the public welfare, is impotent. It has been rendered unable to defend the public interest. it has been rendered unable to defend us. Why didn't we see any of this? We're educated people. We're supposedly the most educated society on the face of the earth. We have the largest number of high school graduates and college graduates. What's going on? Why didn't we see this? We are now at 50 minutes after the hour, so we don't have a whole lot of time left in this first hour. But let me suggest to you to think back on your education, and I think you're going to find out what the answer to those questions is. Why didn't our education prepare us for this kind of thing? Why is it that so few of us know anything about what's going on in this society? Part of it is because our education system, for lack of a better term, has been more the transmission of information under the guise of truth than it has been the ability to think and understand and question and analyze and synthesize and to do research and to go after the kinds of information we need in order to really understand. Think about it. Where else is the tax system so convoluted and complex that most of us have no idea what we owe in taxes? Consequently, we have a multi-million-dollar industry called H&R Block and all of these financial advisors. All these financial firms and organizations that have emerged and are making millions and billions by manipulating and managing our money. Because most of us don't understand it well enough to do that ourselves. We have ended up, most of us, working people, have ended up sitting at a high-stakes table in Las Vegas with somebody telling us that we need to ante up so that the next hand can be dealt or the next spin can happen. But most of us really don't understand the game we're playing. But everything we own in this world, our bank accounts, our retirement savings, our homes, are piled up before us in different colored chips. And we're being told, in order to play at this table, you got to put in so many red chips, so many blue chips. So we're being told what we need to do to play, but we really don't know how the game works. So consequently, we have to go to Acme Financial Advisors and ABC Retirement Planners and all these other organizations that have popped up all over the place. People used to sarcastically refer to the fact that we seem to be a nation of churches. There seemed to be a church on every street corner in America. I would suggest to you, if there is, there's a bank on the other three. Think about the money that people are making by playing with your money. The only one that can't reap the benefits from it, for the most part, is you. Some can. I know people who can. I know people that learned how to play the game, learned how to handle their own investments once they began to realize that they were being paid a modest fee, a guaranteed income of 5% return. While the market, for example, we know right now, we're reading in the press right now, that over the last year, the market has gone up something like I believe it's 24%, maybe even more than that. But most of us are locked into 5% annual returns on our retirement funds. Who's getting the other 19%? Not us. But your financial advisor. Johnny Carson used to refer to his financial advisor as loophole because he would find tax breaks. And so the game has become cheating on your taxes, trying to find ways in order to minimize your taxes. But the real profit is being made elsewhere. It's your money, but it's not your income. What we were looking at yesterday in our second hour was a series of 4 books that were written during the 1850s prior to the Civil War. One of them, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the PR side of our education system. It was designed so that everybody could know the horrors of slavery. It became part of the campaign to build up the morale and support necessary to win the Civil War in the North. But the other 3 books which very few of us have ever heard of, why aren't they in our history books, pointed out the realities of the relationships between North and South. One of them, which was entitled Southern Wealth, Northern Profits, pointed out how for years Southern agriculture, the plantation system in the South, had been feeding raw materials into the emerging industrial system in the North. And for all practical purposes, the South was fulfilling the role of colony to the North, which in this case was fulfilling the role of mother country. And just as the 13 colonies were set up by England in order to feed raw materials to industrial expansion, to commercial and industrial expansion in Great Britain, in England, so the Southern agricultural system was built on the same dependent relationship with the North that colonies have with mother countries. And the author of this book was using the data, and this book is loaded with data, charts, graphs, and numbers, to show the extent to which Northern economic expansion and growth was directly dependent on the relationship that existed between North and South. The thinking of the person, the author of this book, who's Thomas Prentice Long, his idea was once the North realizes how dependent our economy is on the South, then people will find a way to work out the differences between North and South, because we can't let the South secede from the Union. It would be against our economic best interests, our economic well-being. He thought his book was going to be the key factor in holding the Union together. However, once the South saw this data and began to realize that they were being exploited by the North, then that very data became fodder for Southern secessionists, who began to argue just as the colonies declared their independence, so we, the Southern slave states, must declare our independence from this Union in order to stop the exploitation. So this data, in the wrong hands, wasn't sufficient to hold the Union together, but in fact contributed to breaking the Union apart. Fact of the matter, what does this show? It shows that some people understood what was going on and what the economic relationships were between North and South and corporate and non-corporate entities and all the rest of it. But the vast majority of people didn't. Rather, they were subjected to a PR campaign. They got their education from the Uncle Tom's Cabins, that kind of curriculum. This other kind of stuff, like Cannibals All in the South and the impending crisis of the South, Hinton Helper's book, as well as this book, Southern Wealth, Northern Profits. It was important to keep this data out of the wrong hands, because this was powerful information. The general impression was that the vast majority of people weren't capable of handling this kind of information. That's it seems to me, the background, the behind-the-curtain story of some of the things that led to the Civil War, is the fact that people didn't understand what was happening to them. They were going to school, but they weren't learning. They were being given truth. They weren't being shown how to find truth for themselves. How similar the story of our own 401ks, of our retirement situation here in America in the 21st century. Because once again, people ended up being thrust into a situation that they didn't understand and couldn't control for their own best interests. Consequently, they became dependent on others to handle their affairs. And the profits went to the others, not to them. What we're into here are different views of what education is about and might be about and ought to be about in America. That's the theme I'd like to spend our second hour on today. We have reached the top of the hour. Actually, we're 2 minutes beyond. So what we're going to do is pause for a 5-minute break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. After a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the second hour in today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I think what we're really talking about here, at least in our first hour, what we've been suggesting, although not directly addressing, is the issue of civic responsibility. Our education system, we have got to begin to understand some of the things that are happening. We have got to stop believing people who have a particular political or economic agenda in recruiting us to a particular point of view or to a particular economic theology, if you will, which is what we've been looking at here with the resurgence of the so-called idea of laissez-faire economic theology, doctrine, if you will. And what we basically need to do is follow the dictates of the founders. Many of the founders believed that citizenship in a republic demanded that people take control of their own environment, of their own government. That what the very definition of a republic is popular government. And again, many of the founders didn't necessarily believe that everybody was capable of playing a positive, constructive role in their own political futures. But the fact of the matter is that's the structure of government we've been given. That is the basis of American exceptionalism, the potential of this system for what it can do for people. It's up to us to make sure that we realize that potential. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're into here at the Virtual Center. If you are just joining us, welcome to our second hour of today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I really especially want to thank you for staying with us, because I hope the issues that we've been addressing are issues that you found enlightening enough and interesting enough that it caused you to stay. I hope it'll cause you to come back regularly and join us on a regular basis. That's not only what the Virtual Center is about, that's what the Head On Radio Network is about. Basically, what we're talking about here is the side that doesn't get talked about out there. We have got to keep this position alive and flourishing within the marketplace of ideas. We can't allow this voice, this perspective, to be silenced. Our nation can't afford to let that happen. So in a sense, in a very ironic way, I believe the future of our republic is in our hands here on the Head On Radio Network. At the Virtual Center, I believe that's what we're about. We are saving the republic. I mean, I know this is a little bit way out and a little bit extreme, but in a sense, I mean that. I really do. It's what drives me. I hope it's what brings you to us on a regular basis. And so I hope that you and that you'll do all you can to encourage those you know who would appreciate the things that are covered regularly here on the Head On Radio Network will join us. And if you can, you'll make it a point to financially support the Head On Radio Network if you can. Obviously, it's based on an if you can and what you could afford type of situation. Obviously, we are not well funded, but we are darn important. And as we continue to hang in there and as more people begin to appreciate what we're offering here, at one point we will be well funded. I think we believe that. I think the folks at Head On Radio Network believe that. That's what we're about. If we didn't, we'd throw up our hands and call it a day. Love to hear from you. Hope that you'll participate actively in our program. The phone number, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. In our first hour, we basically were talking about some of the things that can happen in a republic, in popular government, when too many of the things that are happening that affect everybody are only understood by a few. When the vast majority of people in a government that theoretically is directly accountable to the people don't understand, don't know what they need to know in order to act and behave appropriately. But the most important danger to all of this is not just in what people don't know. It's the fact that in not knowing, they become vulnerable to those who claim to know. They become vulnerable to the ideas and ideological preferences and priorities of people whose agenda may not be consistent with our own. People who are looking to enlist us in particular camps and categories for political reasons which are painted as opportunities that will benefit us, But in reality, that never seems to happen. More often than not, it benefits them, but not us. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is we keep coming back to this idea of education and what education is, what education could be, what education ought to be, what education must be in order for a republic truly to fulfill its own potential. To basically provide the promise that exists only on paper until the people arm themselves with, as Madison put it in one of his more poignant letters, until people arm themselves with the kind of knowledge that makes us free, really free. Not the kind of knowledge that keeps us from thinking, the kind of knowledge which is touted as truth, which is delivered to us with the idea, you don't need to worry about knowing this. You don't have to know the background of this. You don't have to think. We've done all the thinking. All you need to do is take this list of truths and memorize them, because this is it. You can use your valuable time in more productive ways, because we've gone out there and we've done the thinking for you. And this is what we recommend you believe. And based on that, this is the way we hope you'll behave. And more of us, unfortunately, seem inclined to do that. The fact of the matter is, what we know as education is not the only approach. I mentioned yesterday that I wanted to devote time today. We've got less than our 1 hour here, and we may have to hold a portion of this over to another program, and that's fine if we do. But it'll be next Monday, so it'll be a 5-day hiatus between today and then, and it's going to be probably entirely likely that we'll have to go back and review some of this next Monday. But that's fine, because this is heavy stuff. And maybe a little bit of review every once in a while is a good thing anyway. But I mentioned yesterday that I happened upon a piece in the New York Times yesterday in the op-ed section, an article by Stanley Fish, that I still tingle about even when I think about it. It was in yesterday's New York Times under the heading, Scholarship and Politics, the Case of Noam Chomsky. The date is December 9th, but it was in yesterday's paper, New York Times, which was the 10th, the submission date that Stanley Fish sent this into the New York Times was obviously the day before, Monday. But it appeared in yesterday's New York Times. Scholarship and Politics, the Case of Noam Chomsky. It's an article that many people would find very difficult to, it is very difficult to read. It's philosophy. But it's philosophy with a message that all of us need to hear. I've been in education for 50 years. I was in higher education for close to 40 years. I believe that every administrator, every faculty member, in every college and university in the country ought to be required to read this article. Because I believe that what Stanley Fish has done is lay out a case better than I've ever seen anyone else lay it out as to what education is about when education can function the way education ought to function. Specifically, he's talking about higher education. Specifically, he's talking about the academy, the so-called academy. The halls and classrooms behind the ivy on the college campuses throughout the nation. For better than 100 years, we have listened to those in higher education claim something called academic freedom, suggesting that once a person who is teaching a class enters the classroom and closes that door, then what ought to happen within that classroom is education, learning, thinking, asking questions, disagreeing, debating, arguing, designing plans for research, engaging in the kind of discussion and debate which educates everybody in the room, whatever their particular position on the issue under discussion. What is academic freedom in this kind of a context? Academic freedom is the reality. I was going to say belief, but it's more than a belief, it's a reality. That true learning, the pursuit of knowledge, cannot happen unless the marketplace of ideas is open and free. People need to be free to express themselves. People need to be free to disagree without the fear of retribution, without the fear of being punished for what they believe or for disagreeing. People need to be free to introduce other related issues to the discussion. All of this that happens behind that closed door in a real learning environment, in the academy, as it's called in the abstract, all of that is involved in what we call the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of knowledge. People who are in that room, because every one of them realizes that while they're in that room, they are free to think and to question and to disagree without being punished for it. They are free to throw out ideas and issue possibilities and related considerations to the issue under debate or the issue at hand, to the point that everybody in the room benefits from what everybody else in the room contributes. The result is that when that door opens and those people leave that room and go back out into the world outside the academy, they have crossed the line and walked into a world where political reality holds sway. A world where it is important who you agree with and what you believe and what you practice and what church you go to and what neighborhood you live in and what books you read and what college you went to and what high school you graduated from and all the rest. All of these things that make up the realities of our day-to-day life. All of them, if they were ever allowed to penetrate behind that closed door that is now open, all of them would inhibit or skew the pursuit of truth and knowledge that was going on within that room. In other words, the pursuit of knowledge and truth couldn't happen unless that door was closed and this other world that we all know so well is kept outside. I believe this. I've believed it all my life. I know and have met many people in my professional life who believe the same kinds of things. But I have also met a lot of people who don't. I have met a lot of people who believed that what academic freedom is the right to tell students whatever you want them to believe and demand that they believe it in order to pass your course. If you're a liberal, your goal is to turn out a classroom full of little liberals. If you're conservative, your goal is to turn out a group of believing conservatives. I would suggest to you that that happens when the door is open. That's why the academy must operate with the door closed. There are too many factors and issues which affect the pursuit of truth and knowledge and keep it from happening. Example? Let me give you one of the first examples that comes to mind. Philadelphia, 1787, the Constitutional Convention. No sooner did the delegates convene the meeting did they elect George Washington as president of the group. And then they began to discuss the rules of procedure, how the meetings, the discussions would go. And one of the first decisions they made was to close that door. The only way that people could really express what they really believed was if the outside world didn't know who was saying what in that room. Because if the people in that room started to play to the crowd and started to play the role of Cicero, the public speaker, or the friend of the poor and the downtrodden, or whatever other role they wanted the general public to believe they played, all of those things would inhibit the business of the convention. So the decision was made, whatever happens in this room stays in this room. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What that tells us is that these people knew going in that the business they were about was serious business. And the reason that they were there was to represent the best interests of the people who sent them there. And the only way they could do that is if they felt free and honest and able to think and discuss and disagree and contradict and preach and cry and scream and swear and curse and whatever else they felt that they needed to do in order to make the point that they felt needed to be made. All of this based on the assumption, idealistic as it is, that the marketplace of ideas is real. That real truth emerges from this free exchange of ideas and positions and counter-arguments. That everybody learns from what everybody else has to contribute. And if there's anything that is keeping you from expressing your point of view on a particular issue, the entire enterprise suffers. If you decide that to say what you feel you ought to say would make you unpopular or would irritate some people that you didn't want to irritate. In other words, if you had political considerations which were causing you to speak or not speak, more important, were dictating what you said and what you didn't say, then the result of the entire enterprise experience, the entire convention, would be demeaned and diminished and reduced. You would be cheating everybody. That you were depriving of the point that you decided to not make. Can I divert for a second into something else which is related directly to that? At the beginning of every hour here at the Virtual Center, I share with you an email address and a phone number. The reason that I give you that phone number is because I want this experience, this Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, to become the digital version of what can happen behind that closed door when the world as we know it is locked outside. I want exchange and communication. I want to believe that at the end of our time together on a particular day or in a particular hour, that everybody can leave knowing more than they knew when they came in. And that means not just what I have to contribute to the Virtual Center, but what every one of you can contribute as well. Because I know that what I'm introducing here are concepts and ideas that for many people are new. I'm not saying they are new. I'm not claiming any kind of innovation or anything else on my part. But what I am saying is that I'm pretty confident that many of the things I have to contribute to this discussion about the world of the U.S. Constitution and civic responsibility are ideas which require reflection and response and exchange and criticism and question and expansion and analysis and revisiting over and over again. I know that what I learn depends on what you bring to this discussion. I know that what you learn depends on me to a large degree, but it also depends on everybody else who's tuned in. And if the people who are tuned in feel that they have something to contribute that really increases and expands everybody's ability to understand the concept that's being discussed at the moment, if they don't say it, if they don't contribute it, all of us lose. I lose for what you don't say. This is the ideal of the virtual center. I see the virtual center as a digital version of academic freedom on display, where people have a real opportunity to exchange ideas and to share arguments and points of view and to criticize and not feel that they're going to be punished for it or belittled for it or criticized for it or graded down for it or fired for it or expelled for it or whatever the other penalties we give in order to control what happens in a classroom, which we claim is designed to promote learning, but in reality, more often than not, operates to promote consensus, to sell a point of view, to convince people in that room that there's only one version of truth on this particular matter, and here it is. Memorize it, because there'll be a test on it tomorrow. The Stanley Fish article in yesterday's New York Times makes this case. My God, it's wonderful. With that, let me go to the piece. We are at 35 minutes after the hour. We got 25 minutes left, and we haven't even started the agenda, which was really my agenda for the day today. But that's okay. We'll pursue it next time. What makes this particularly significant is that in this play, the lead actor is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is one of the most noted scholars in the area of linguistics in the world, the study of language. He's the godfather, or at least one of the godfathers, of linguistics. But he is so well educated and so well versed that not only does he talk about linguistics when the door is closed, but when the door is open and he goes outside into the world that the rest of us live in, he has incredibly perceptive things to say about the Middle East, about warfare, about capitalism, about communism, about free enterprise, about the military, about foreign policy, about humanity and human relations in the world. He's considered to be one of the world's most prominent spokesmen. By the mainstream, Noam Chomsky is considered to be, in the minds of many, a radical. And the issue is, can somebody be a political firebrand, a political radical, a troublemaker, and yet at the same time remain one of the world's most noted scholars? How do you do that? He did it. And Stanley Fish was there. And Stanley Fish wrote about it in the New York Times yesterday. And what he says is that Noam Chomsky basically gave a clear example to everybody of the extent to which it's possible for a person to be effective and influential behind the closed door and outside of it at the same time. That academic freedom really does mean something. When you have the responsibility and the position to teach students, you have the opportunity to go into that classroom with those students. You have the opportunity to close that door. But you also have the responsibility to not bring the political and economic considerations from outside into that room. Once that door closes, you are an academic. And as long as you remain an academic, you are entitled to the free exchange and pursuit of truth. But if you ever allow yourself to bring the factors on the other side of that door into that classroom, you cease to be an educator. You become instead a pariah. You become a preacher. You have shifted from a person who wants to lead others in the strategies of pursuing real truth to someone who comes into a room and said, "Don't bother thinking, guys. I've already done it. Here it is." You have violated every responsibility and right of an academic. Not only that, but you have violated the credibility and the trust of every other academic. Because if you do that, you are weakening academic freedom. And if you weaken academic freedom, you make the pursuit of truth less and less likely and less possible. So your responsibility as an academic is incredibly important. You are entitled to academic freedom. You have a responsibility not to abuse that freedom. And what Stanley Fish points out is that Noam Chomsky did not do that. He did not violate his academic responsibilities. Even though he was Noam Chomsky. Even though the fact of the matter is a lot of people that came to listen to him believed that the academic title of his presentations was immaterial, because ultimately what Chomsky was going to do was be to start pontificating on foreign policy and economic issues and political issues from around the world. He would start to say intriguing, controversial things. Things that the mainstream media and many people associated with the establishment find offensive and dangerous. Chomsky was going to say stuff that was provocative and worth hearing. That's why some people were there, probably. But the fact of the matter is, Fish says that Chomsky never varied. Never for 1 second did he violate his responsibility to pursue academic freedom and to pursue it responsibly. With that introduction, let me begin. This is all that we won't probably even have time for this. But Noam Chomsky was invited to deliver the John Dewey Lectures at Columbia University in the philosophy department. John Dewey, many of you know, was one of America's greatest philosophers. And he was, you know, the John Dewey Lectures is a series of lectures annually, and a prominent philosopher is invited to deliver them. And in 2013, actually 2 weeks ago, I think from the 3rd to the 5th of December, Chomsky delivered 3 lectures in the John Dewey Lecture Series at Columbia University. And that's what this paper is about, are those 3 lectures. Fish begins with a paragraph about his own view of what academic freedom and responsibility are all about. And he says the following: "The views that I've been peddling to various audiences without notable success are," and now he's basically explaining what I've been talking about for the last hour. 1. The Academy is a world of its own, complete with rules, protocols, systems of evaluation, recognized achievements, agreed-on goals, a roster of heroes, and a list of tasks yet to be done. In other words, the Academy is a special place. It's a place in a world of its own. It's a place which has its own world, its rules, its own behavior, its own objectives, its own definition of success, its own roster of heroes, and all the rest of it. And in a way, that's kind of what I believe I said earlier. Number 2, academic work proceeds within the confines of that world. Within that is a professional, not a public space, although its performance may be and often is public. In other words, a lot of people in the world may be paying close attention to what you're saying and what you're doing in that world, in that academic world. But the fact of the matter is, as long as you are doing academic work, that's what that world exists for. And as a professional educator, your role is to adhere to the requirements and the responsibilities associated with that world. And as long as you do, you are entitled to the freedom that goes with it and is so necessary to the pursuit of truth. Accordingly, Fish says, number 3, academic work is only tangentially, not essentially political. Politics may attend the formation of academic units and the selection of academic personnel, but political concerns and political pressures have no place in the unfolding of academic argument except as objects of its distinctive forms of attention. In other words, behind that door, within that classroom, politics can be the focus of the discussion, but the agenda cannot be political. In other words, it can be an example of this would be studying the Bible as literature. Most people believe that the purpose of the Bible is to convert, is to persuade, is to reveal doctrinal truth to the reader. But the issue is, Scripture is history. Scripture is literature. Is it possible to look at the Bible that way and not get into the political issues surrounding it? That's what Fish is talking about here. Academic work is only tangentially, not essentially political. Politics may be the subject of discussion, but political concerns and political pressures have no place within the academic argument, because if they're allowed in it, the academic argument falls apart, because people feel that they can not or should say certain things and not say other things. And once that happens, the whole process is demeaned. The whole process becomes tainted. So as he points out, politics does have its own distinctive forms of attention. Without it, he says, it would be shapeless. It would not even be a thing. It would have no shape, no form, no purpose. And finally, the fourth item here in Stanley Fischer's list, the academic views of a professor are independent of his or her real-world political views. In other words, what you do in that classroom is different than what you do outside it. You may have academic freedom inside that classroom. You don't have it outside. You don't have the same right outside. Outside, you're liable. Outside, you're expected to behave and say certain things and not say other things. You're supposed to behave in accepted ways. Inside that classroom, as long as what you say and what you think are contributing to the pursuit of truth, then you have a right to say them and think them. So, again, the academic views, number 4, of a professor are independent of his or her real-world political views. Academic disputes don't track partisan disputes or vice versa. You can't reason from an academic's disciplinary views to the positions he or she would take in the public sphere. They are independent variables. The rights and responsibilities that you have behind that door are different from the ones that you have outside it. And here's the point that Fish makes about the Dewey series that Noam Chomsky delivered. Now, as everyone knows, Noam Chomsky is a distinguished academic, a scholar, who pretty much single-handedly reconfigured the discipline of linguistics and a strong presence in the landscape of other disciplines: philosophy of mind, psychology, biology, literary criticism, to name but a few. But Chomsky is also a prominent public intellectual whose opinions on a wide range of political topics, American foreign policy, the Middle East, capitalism, fossil fuels, education, etc., are well known and often controversial. So the question was, which Chomsky was going to show up at Columbia University? Or alternatively, could you have one without the other? The answer, it turned out, is yes. If the answer had turned out to be no, then academic freedom, as we know it, could no longer exist. But I would ask you to think and reflect upon the fact as we move towards the conclusion of our time together today. It's 53 minutes after the hour. I would ask you to think about and reflect on the fact of how important it is that those two worlds remain independent of each other. I've mentioned more than once here about my participation in a conservative scholarly organization called the National Association of Scholars. And they have their annual conventions pretty much either at Princeton University in New Jersey or in New York City. A couple of years, I've gone to several of their conventions. A couple of years ago, I went to one of the annual conventions of the National Association of Scholars at Princeton. And a discussion broke out in the room, and the discussion was about politics. And it was one of the most revealing discussions I had ever witnessed in my life. Because up to that point, I really didn't know all that much about the National Association of Scholars, except that they were committed, that the organization was committed to scholarship. It was committed to the value of the pursuit of truth. That's what I knew. That's why I went. That's why I joined. This political discussion happened, and it went on for better than almost 2 hours. And it gradually began to change direction from a discussion about politics as a discipline, as a subject for study, to the political realities of the modern world. In other words, the door opened. And suddenly all the political pressures in the outside world came into that room. And suddenly speakers, no longer was the pursuit of truth the objective of that meeting. Now, the political objectives of the National Association of Scholars became the subject at hand. What do we need to do in order to retake the academy? What do we as conservatives need to do in order to take back colleges and universities in this country from liberals of the 1960s and 70s who have taken over our campuses? What can we do and should we do? Can we continue to remain silent? Mustn't we become much more aggressive and outspoken in our positions? Mustn't we go back to our campuses and challenge the liberalism that prevails there? Must we not go back to our departments and divisions and demand equal treatment? Must we begin to demand that they hire more conservatives on the faculty? That conservative positions be more evident and more visible at faculty meetings and in policy and programs and curriculum and agenda and hiring policies and all the rest of it? Shouldn't we go back and begin to demand that faculties be made up of both conservatives and liberals? And suddenly I began to realize that what I thought was a scholarly pursuit of truth had turned into a union meeting, but a very unique kind of union meeting. And finally, literally busting at the seams, I stuck my hand up and I said, it was about 3 or 4 years ago, and I can't remember exactly everything I said, but my major position was, I thought scholarship was apolitical. I didn't know that in order to be a real scholar, you had to be a political conservative, because I'm not. I thought that true scholarship was apolitical, and that what we were about was true scholarship, not political strategy. And immediately the entire tone of the rest of the meeting shifted, and it was very obvious that people were basically looking around saying, who is this guy? How did he sneak in? I began to realize then that the line between one side of the door and the other, that door is not that thick, and that lock is not that secure. And I began to realize that academic freedom in this country is really in trouble. And we are at 59 minutes after the hour, and I apologize that we haven't gotten further, but I look forward to introducing this topic again when we get together next time. In the meantime, I hope that you have a wonderful evening, a wonderful week. Be safe. We want you back on the Head On Radio Network and here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you.